for example, we're dealing now with the question of how the human mind works. And that's the issue we're dealing with when looking at Mars. I mean, to summarize what I said on this one thing, is that the significance of curiosity is that it forces us to recognize that given the large panoply of factors which are taken into account by NASA, and in this case, we don't even approach satisfactory answers. So that we are faced with questions to which we have to find the solutions. And therefore, this means that we have to look at something wrong with our system. And what was wrong with our system is that when we're operating on a very small scale, like an Earth scale, we don't have a sufficient order of magnitude of fact and evidence to question certain kinds of considerations. Now, when we're looking at this operation with curiosity, and it really is a very good name for it.
Yes.
Actually. I don't think there was a childish thought in anybody's mind when that was said, unless you had a very brilliant child. But the point is, how are we dealing with this question, this Mars now? What's the change? We are actually operating in control of Mars as an experimental object at the speed of light. So we now have receptacles on Mars which we use to measure effects which are transmitted to us at the speed of light. In other words, you have changes in process, but the changes in process you can measure at the rate of the speed of light. That makes things much more interesting. All right. So now you have a possibility of discovery on the basis, because even doing this is an experiment. But the real fun comes when you start looking at the order of magnitude of evidence, of factors of evidence, and you look at them and you say, wait a minute, all this stuff we have, which we consider evidence when we look at the human mind on Earth, all this is not really adequate. When we can go beyond these limitations, and we must go beyond these limitations to find out things that we cannot find in terms of these collections of apparatus. Now, how do we do that? We do that because at the speed of light, you are introducing a factor of measurement which we, working from Earth, on Earth, could not really find convenient to us. This is a very convenient experiment. You have all this apparatus that corresponds to sense perception on Earth. It's a little more complicated in some respects than sense perception on Earth is usually practiced. But we know that sense perception, and anything like sense perception, no matter how much you expand it from our knowledge of human experience, we have been expanding our knowledge of sense perception. But we have by no means reached anything of the scale we want to reach. What do we have that is better than sense perception? Speed of light. When you are measuring things in terms of the speed of light on these scales, you are now getting into a beginning understanding of mankind. You no longer are dependent upon human sense perception, even somewhat augmented human sense perception. You now are able to think in terms of things like interaction. We are interacting with all this mess out there on the route to Mars. It's a very crude kind of measurement we make at first. But the fact that we're operating at the speed of light and observing changes at the speed of light, because we're conducting the experiment on such a large scale, in terms of you have a lapse of time between the 2 points of any experiment through the speed of light that you don't have otherwise, which means that we're opening up a completely new way of thinking about the human mind. And instead of looking at the human mind the way we do now, we're going to begin to look at it from the standpoint of the speed of light differences that we're observing. We're going to look at, we have those evidences available, but we want to put various kinds of experiment under that rigor again and test a lot of these things in that fashion. because we would like to put apparatus on pieces of junk we find out there in between Earth and Mars. Because if we want to defend Earth, we don't know most of the junk that's floating out there. We don't even detect it. And this junk can kill us because we have a limited ability to pick up the identity of a piece of junk like that and intersect it and cause it to move out of the trajectory of Earth in time. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if we can start to plant some shills out there, so to speak, some electronic shills out there on pieces of junk that we happen to locate, we can use the relationships among the motions among those pieces of junk and begin to interpret what that means. And we get a better grip on what this junk is going to do to us and what we can do to it. Because if we get out there and take a complex of a bunch of these floating objects out there in space, and if we can get a control over that and how that package works, we can now then begin to find out how the trajectories are organized in terms of this area between Mars down into the Venus area. We get a sense of a control over that. Mm-hmm. We can now look at the whole mass as a mass effect rather than trying to just rely on picking out one piece at a time. And therefore, if we can take what we've done, we've gone beyond simple sense perception. We've now gone into this Mars operation, where we're operating at the speed of light. And when we can control interactions which are related at the speed of light, we can deal with complexes of the evidence out there which can be used as an instrument to discover how to catch these things and how to deal with them, and to organize devices by which we can create a net to control them. So we want to take this whole system, reduce this whole system of cosmic elements floating out there, reduce that to a manageable process. It's not a matter of trying to find the individual piece. That's virtual, but that's good. But it's not enough. What you've got to do is start to create an influence on the way these things are organized. And it's only by controlling the mass or influencing the mass. In other words, you can get a very small degree of increment of change in a relationship in this mass out there. You can begin if you can hit enough spots, you can begin to define what the behavior of that mass is. And rather than looking for one at a time shots on a particular piece of rock, you're now looking at the behavior of a collection of these pieces of rock. Once you can get that kind of information, you can go further. And the same thing applies to larger matters. Speed of light, if mankind can use the speed of light in this way and base everything on it, we can define a completely new physics, at least a practical physics for the purpose of defense of Earth. Mm-hmm. And this opens the gate. And I think a generation, if we can do that, will be sufficient, which means we have to get rid of things like Obama, which won't let this happen. But mankind, the dangers are great, the unknowns are threatening, ominous. But if we can do something within a generation to get us parked on the course that we need, and since we already have the ability with this recent Mars achievement, we now have an affirmation of the ability to do things like this. So it's going to take us probably another generation before we can do this on any significant scale, apart from the pilot scale now. But these measures should be sufficient to save a lot of human lives and to give us a perspective for what our future in nearby space is going to be.
And there's no difference between the Mars program and defense.
None.
Because the whole point is you're expanding mankind's power, mankind's capability, mankind's sphere of influence and control into these domains. So the ultimate defense is going to be not just being able to blast one rock with a missile from Earth, but actually developing this whole region and expanding, I think as you used to discuss with the conception of the platforms to elevate the discussion of infrastructure because it become a banalized word, looking at the conception of success as stages of mankind's control and development of an entire space, an entire region. That's how we have to think about this. It's mankind expanding the power of mind to this whole Venus-Earth range And that's going to define defense and advance as one concept.
But it's not going to be any more in ballistic.
No,
The ballistic control of history is about to be exhausted at welcome.
Right.
The point is, our job is to be able to control this, gain control over these processes, and to take processes which are menacing and disorderly and bring them into conformity with some benefit from a human standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And to redefine the human standpoint as in terms of what we can do in the universe.
Which goes right to the thermonuclear question.
Exactly.
Constant acceleration, increase in the power density that mankind can wield and control.
Yeah. And otherwise you are stultifying progress.
Mm-hmm.
You must have, progress must lead to more progress. You can't have, say, we can start from scratch again and be progressive on this thing, drop that, do this, with the percussive interventions in between. We have to really think about our will, human will, to shape and influence the environment in which we live, to do good. And that's it, and there's a limited amount of good that we can do within our lifetimes. But we do that. And we do that as the inspiration of doing the next thing. And I would say that this has been my intention. You know, the landing on Mars, the man on Mars, has been with me for some time. As a mission, I thought was essential. And I saw it as a product of what we're doing with the SDI. Mm-hmm. The SDI, my getting into doing that was just changed my view of things. And I was dealing with all the kind of political issues and so forth that were normal for that period. And once you got into this thing, I got into this thing and began to see the whole need for a whole change in the point of view. You had to look at this new point of view instead of reacting to facts, reacting to this development. Think about how you can reshape the course of history. Get out of the limits with which you're operating. Mm-hmm. And the SDI was that. That's a good thing.
Right. Remember, you were making the point in the 80s at a certain point that the Moon-Mars mission as a science driver would necessitate the development of all the technologies that would be involved in the SDI. So again, it's a total unity. If you push the frontiers, like you're saying, completely, you blow away the current confines. You just surpass the whole current context of discussion with these science driver programs, and then you're redefining mankind. You're redefining mankind's capabilities.
Well, what I did is I had as a result of the SDI operation, we had scientists in various parts of Europe and so forth who had participated in my designing of this process. And so once the thing was done, we had done it, we came up to the point of frustration that the President Reagan faced, as I did. We simply continued on this space program on the basis of what we had assembled around SDI, in which you had a project SDI, which had a very strict mission orientation, and a very good one. But there were a lot of things cast on the workbenches beside the project itself, which became evidence to work on. So when we went to the middle of the 1980s, we had a picture. I was frustrated at that point because I thought the space program was going too slow, because it was being held back by these factors. And so what happened is then a couple of years later, I did the Woman on Mars, just to take the package of what we knew at that point and push it forward and say we can do this. We can present this as a popular conception for you to understand it as a pedagogical experiment. And it did that job. But now you go on to the next level. That job is only a stepping stone to prepare for the next one. And right now, this is it. This actual launching on Mars now has made a slight change, but it's at the speed of light with a panoply of apparatus, which gives us a range we never had before of this type. And it's the panoply which includes the elements which are already put into the space program for Mars relevance. Now we have an apparatus which is complex enough that to be able to operate at the speed of light within that framework between here and Mars, you now have enough range of things to play with and to expand upon, which enables you to do some things. And I just want, well, let's get 20 or 30 of these things, these kinds of experiments going out to Mars as fast as possible. Because in order to get to this point what I've envisaged beyond, you have to have a lot of work put into it. You've got to have much more complex systems. You've got to have all kinds of experimental work done on Mars by aid of these systems. And if we can operate within this whole range, I mean the range from south of Jupiter, right? Starting from the Mars down to essentially Venus, if you can explore in that area with apparatus of this type, of that meaning, mankind has a real shot at discovering what man can be. Mm-hmm. But the point is, how are we dealing with this question, this Mars now? What's the change? We are actually operating in control of Mars as an experimental object at the speed of light. For example, we're dealing now with the question of how the human mind works. And that's the issue we're dealing with when looking at Mars. I mean, to summarize what I said on this one thing, is that the significance of curiosity, solutions. And therefore, this means that we have to look at something wrong with our system. And what was wrong with our system is that when we're operating on a very small scale, like an Earth scale, we don't have a sufficient order of magnitude of fact and evidence to question certain kinds of considerations. Now, when we're looking at this operation with curiosity, and it really is a very good name for it.
Yes.
Actually. I don't think there was a childish thought in anybody's mind when that was said, unless you had a very brilliant child, is that it forces us to recognize that given the large panoply of factors which are taken into account by NASA, and in this case, we don't even approach satisfactory answers. So we are faced with questions to which we have to find the solution.